Hello, everyone. Welcome back to STATEC Researchers Seminar Series on Measuring Progress and Wellbeing. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Leonie Steckermeier, who will discuss how various inequalities shape and fuel well-being inequality. Leonie will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And a last reminder, we are recording. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and YouTube channel. Now to introduce Dr. Leonie Steckermeier. Leonie is a postdoctoral researcher at the Chair of Macrosociology, Otto van Goethe University, Magdeburg, in Germany, where she also completed her PhD in 2022. Her research expertise centers around the domains of quality of life and subjective well-being, social inequality, individual autonomy, and trust. Her work has been published in several international journals, such as International Journal of Comparative Sociology, World Development, and Social Indicators Research. I'm particularly looking forward to this presentation. We are overdue for a presentation on inequality, and Leonie is truly an expert, not just on income inequality, but multiple forms of inequality, including the too little researched well-being inequality. Without further ado, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Leonie Steckermeier. Leonie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to do this talk. Because it gave me an opportunity and a reason to look into a lot of things that I want to go into more in the future, one of which is going beyond income inequality, looking at other types of inequalities, and the other is inequality in well-being, like happiness inequality, that has become more and more a topic that is being researched now. And I think you oversold me a little bit as an expert in inequality. I have done some things on inequality, especially relating to how inequality relates to negative status experiences, such as inferiority feelings or status anxiety, people feeling looked down on, and on how inequality relates to social problems in societies. But there is still a lot out there relating to how inequality shapes well-being that is new to me, and this was a great opportunity to get a better overview, and I would like to share some of this overview with you today. When we think about inequality, and when we hear talks from colleagues or read papers on inequality relating to well-being, I think we all can agree on our mind immediately jumps to income inequality. And this, of course, makes sense because we have a lot of data. It's easy to measure inequality. It's comparable across societies. It's available. You can have long time series. You can compare a lot of countries, and money is important in different countries, but it's not the only thing that shapes well-being, and we all know that, I believe. And now my presentation won't move. It does. Perfect. Just to give you an idea, I present you the social structure of well-being. It doesn't matter if you look at life satisfaction or happiness. As you can see, of course, income is an important aspect when we look at subjective well-being, but it's not the only aspect that shapes or structures subjective well-being. You can see on the left side, the life satisfaction is structured a little bit more strongly by vertical parameters, such as education or income or your occupational status. Than is happiness, where other more horizontal aspects such as gender or age have a more stronger impact on how happy people are. But overall, subjective well-being is shaped by other things than income. And I don't want to go down the path of an ecological fallacy and say, oh, there are the aspects on individual level, and that is why other aspects on macro level should have an impact. But it's plausible that there are other inequalities, especially that that shape well-being other than economic inequalities. And this is something I want to go into more in my future research. To start with, let's take a look at how income inequality relates to well-being. And I was kind of surprised to find that there's actually about 1/3 of the literature that finds a positive relationship, a 1/3 that finds a negative, and 1/3 finds no relationship. And these results are just taken from the World Database of Happiness, everything there is on income inequality in nation. But you would find similar distribution of positive, negative, and non-significant results if you look in reviews or meta-analysis like this one, for example. You can see there is about an equal share of positive, non-significant, and negative results, and we will go into reasons why that is a little bit later. But first, let's contrast that to a different type of inequality, namely gender inequality, which is the second most listed or coded inequality in the World Database of Happiness. And here we can see that there is a negative. Most predominantly, there is a negative relationship. So higher levels of gender inequality relate to lower levels of subjective well-being. And of course, there can be multiple reasons why we only have a bunch of negative results and no positive results. Could be a matter of measurement. Very often, inequality in gender is measured more as a discrimination than actual inequality, and it could be a publication bias as well. But still, if we assume that this is true, then the question is, how do these two inequalities differ? And that means, what is the difference between income and gender, or a difference between income inequality and gender inequality? And we have to find this out first before we go further into looking at different types of inequality. And the first thing, of course, that comes to mind when we compare, when we want to know what is the difference between income and gender, both are characteristics taken from the socio-demographics of people, are characteristics to describe people, is that income is something that is acquired. It's a vertical parameter alongside with the 3P, prestige, privilege, and power, where you can have more or less of something, and how much you have sort of describes where you stand in the social hierarchy, whereas gender is a typically ascribed parameter. It's a horizontal parameter alongside with, for example, your age, or migration status would be something like that, where there's no more of it. So it's not a good thing to be more female or more migration status. It's just a discrimination between different types or different characteristics. And the second important difference between income and gender, and thus maybe the relating inequality, is that when we look at it from a social inequality perspective, where we would argue that social inequality only exists when people frequently receive more of a society's valuable goods due to their position in the social hierarchy. Income can be classified as a valuable good that we all agree on is valuable and we want more of it. And gender is more of a determinant. So it's not a valuable good to be female or male, but instead being female or male can shape how much you receive of certain valuable goods. And this then would describe the inequality aspect. The third point relates to the question whether inequality is objectionable, because of course not everything that is unequal is automatically a problem or a problem that we should deal with. If we have inequality in height or in shoe size, it doesn't matter, because it's not a valuable good, and it's not objectionable in the sense that it harms people or that it is disruptive to society. With income inequality, it is not as obvious as with gender inequality, how objectionable certain levels are. So with gender, it would be hard to make an argument where anything else but equality in the distribution of valuable goods between genders would be okay, or would be something that we aspire to as a society. So here we could say equality is the goal. So if gender inequality relates to a valuable good, then the only thing we could aspire to ideally as a society would be equality. The same is not necessarily true with income inequality. We probably can all agree that complete income inequality would be a bad thing. That would be probably very disruptive to society and very harmful to a lot of people. But I don't even know if that is technically possible in the real world to have complete income inequality. On the other hand, complete equality is not necessarily a good thing either, because it could be harmful to people, and it could also be disruptive to society in the sense that it would reduce efficiency, in a sense that you would lose, especially in capitalist societies, or for people who have been socialized in a capitalist society, a certain type of reward for people to contribute more to society, to be rewarded for putting in more training or more skills or more work or whatever you need to get people to do certain jobs or actions in society. So a complete level of equality could be disruptive to society. So there's probably something in between that would be aspirable.
Leonie,
Sorry.
if I may, real quick. So you had a question in the chat about gender inequality in what? So that, as an example, gender income inequality.
Yeah,
I imagine
gender.
it could be across multiple dimensions, but maybe if you could just describe that for us a little more completely, how this is typically done or what you mean.
Well, a typical measure of gender inequality would be gender inequality in labor market participation, in pay, or in political participation. So just the ratio of women compared to men.
Thank you.
Okay, then because it's not about how many women or men we have, that is not, most societies have equal amounts of those, and you cannot share gender across people like you can share income differently across people. Okay, the fourth point where the two inequalities differ is in how they're perceived by people. And here, a general argument is that income inequality is perceived by people as fair because it is. So people are socialized in a society that has a certain level of income inequality, and you see that level of inequality, and you say, this is how it is, so this must be good. So there must be a reason why some people earn more than others, and then this must be a good thing. So fairness perceptions of inequality do usually not relate to levels of inequality in income. So gender inequality is unrelated to how fair people perceive income inequality or an income distribution. Whereas with gender inequality, we don't really know how it's related, and my assumption would be that people perceive income inequality to be stronger when it is actually weaker. This is sometimes called the Tocqueville paradox, where inequalities are perceived as more outrageous when they are very, very small, because then every little thing that deviates from equality looks more strong than when you have more inequality overall. To illustrate this, I brought a scatter plot of income inequality and perceptions of inequality fairness. And as you can see, there is no relationship. So people perceive their country as, or their society, or the distribution of incomes in their society as fair, irrespective of the level of income inequality. For gender inequality, the picture looks different. As you can see here on the right side is the objective measure of gender inequality compared to a subjective assessment of equality by women in this case. And as you can see, most countries have a very different level of objective and objective level of gender inequality and subjective perception. In that way that in countries with higher gender equality, women perceive more gender inequality. And the last point I want to make to the difference between income inequality and gender inequality is how it relates to people's position in society, because we know for income inequality that there is a relationship between where people stand in the society, how they perceive inequality. This is also called nearsightedness of income evaluation, where people at the top have it easier to assume other people's income at the top, and people at the bottom are better at guessing other people's income at the bottom, and therefore we have a distortion of the perceived income inequality, where people at the bottom perceive higher levels of income inequality than people at the top. And because income inequality is or any inequality is very abstract, that actual level of inequality is probably not what harms people, but it is what they perceive to be the level of inequality. So this is an issue because this would mean that people at the bottom are harmed much more strongly by income inequality because they perceive it more strongly than people at the top of the hierarchy. For gender inequality, because it's not inequality in gender, but inequality in something else, in some valuable good like income or power between gender, would then probably be both structured by that valuable good. So we would see the same issue with the structural position, but we might also see differences between the group, in this case, gender. But again, we don't have much research on that now, so this is just an educated guess. As you can see here, I've just illustrated these ideas quickly with data from the European Quality of Life Survey. And on the left side, you can see that it is income inequality has the structural position aspect, where people in higher income levels have a much flatter slope between income inequality and life satisfaction. And the lower down the income groups you go, the steeper is the relationship between income inequality and life satisfaction. And for gender inequality, we can see that there is a small but significant difference on how gender inequality relates to life satisfaction between men and women, where women are a little bit happier in more gender equal countries, and men are a little bit more satisfied with their lives in gender unequal countries. We can also see in relation to income that also here gender inequality is felt more strongly at the lower rungs of income than it is at the higher rungs. However, there is no cross relation between the two. It's not that women at the top feel gender inequality more stronger than men at the top, or in any other of the income groups. So there is a difference in structure and in horizontal groups, but it isn't interrelated. When we now move up on country level to finally look a little bit more at inequality and not so much at the social structure, there is also a few things that we know about income inequality or economic inequalities in general that we don't know about other inequalities. And one of these is that similar to the structural position thesis, there are differences between countries. So what we see here, I'm sorry, it doesn't show on the graph, is global data from the Gallup World Poll, taken from the World Happiness Report. And if we divide countries into different income groups, the World Bank income groups, you can see that depending on the income groups, the relationship between income inequality and life satisfaction varies. So that in high income countries and in low income countries, there is a negative relationship between the two, whereas in the middle income countries, those that are transitioning, we see a positive impact, and we will come back in a few minutes to why that might be. And this is not just for Gini coefficient. We could look at other measures of economic inequality and would see very similar results. So it's important to take control or to consider the country groups, the level of economic prosperity for economic inequality and its relationship to subjective well-being. But the question is, what do we need to look at for other types of inequality? And because I didn't have any other idea, I just started with the same, which is quite useful, I think. So we take the same assumption, different levels of economic prosperity might produce different relationships between inequalities and life satisfaction, also in the realm of social inequality. And for this first example, I think we can see that this is not the worst idea to start with. So what we can see is that inequality in education is practically irrelevant for people's life satisfaction in middle and lower income group, but it has a negative, there's a negative relationship in high income countries. A similar, more similar picture to the economic inequalities comes up when we look at political inequality. Here too, we have this very similar relationship in the higher income groups and in the lower, and there's the lower middle income group where there's practically no relationship. And again, similar picture we can see for gender inequality. Here too, it makes sense to distinguish between different income groups. And there is also no difference whether we look at men and women separately or together. The relationship between gender inequality and the Cantor ladder of life satisfaction is negative only in some of the income groups, but not in all of them. But of course, for future research, we need to find other groupings that might be more relevant to these differences on country level than only the economic differences, levels of economic prosperity. But it's a good starting point. However, this does not yet answer how we come from inequality to, oh no, I still have one left. I'm sorry. Really quickly, ecological inequality. I would have loved to bring you more, but there isn't anything. There's very little research yet on ecological inequality. I found this one really interesting paper by Boyce et al., who provide 3 measures of environmental inequality. And they do a Gini of exposure to air pollution and other toxins. And And I thought the Gini is really interesting because it points out the issues that we have with these types of inequalities. It's not as clear cut as it is with income inequality. Because what would be an ideal level of exposure to air toxins and other pollutants? Would we be happier as a society to have these exposure distributed equally across everyone, like we have with microplastic, or would it be normatively better to have most people not being exposed to such environmental problems, and then a few people very, very strongly? So the question of inequality here when it comes to exposure to environmental problems also brings up the question of what would be a good level of inequality, and is this really a problem that we can address as inequality, or doesn't it make any sense? This is why I didn't bring the Gini. Instead, I brought the exposure by poverty, and what they did is, this is done for the US states. They checked how they provide a ratio of the exposure to these air pollutants and other toxins, comparing poor people and rich people. And the higher the number is, the higher is the number of poor people exposed compared to the rich people exposed. And what you can see here is that there is, again, a negative relationship between this ecological inequality and life satisfaction. However, when we look into the structural position thesis here, we will find that there's not really a difference between income groups. There's not really a difference between educational groups. There is, however, and I found this really nice, a difference between age groups, where you can see that the age group 60 plus is literally unaffected by this ecological inequality in their life satisfaction. And it's mostly the young people who bring about this negative relationship, which fits nicely with this whole narrative of young people being more environmentally conscious. But unfortunately, there's nothing else I could show you on ecological inequality. I think we need more ideas here, and should look into possible and practical ways to measure this more widely and provide data so that people can actually see whether there is a relationship between ecological inequality and life satisfaction. So now we will move on to the question that has not been asked and answered yet, and that is, how does inequality impact subjective well-being? Not in the sense that it does it positively or negatively, but what is the mechanism in between? And in the literature, two groups of mechanisms have been provided. One is relates to the externalities produced by inequality, mostly relating to infrastructure and institutions. And the other one relates to social psychological mechanisms that are heightened when inequality is high, and then lead to lower levels of subjective well-being. I will go quickly through them because I see the time running. One of the most popular relationships that has been posed, or mechanisms, is the social problem and conflict issue. So in countries where you have higher levels of inequality, you have more social problems, you have more social conflicts, and that in turn reduces overall subjective well-being. And a group or two researchers that have brought this idea of linking inequality to social problems, like made it very popular, were Wilkinson and Pickett in their spirit level theory, where they showed that inequality leads to a lot of health and social problems, to children experiencing more conflict, to more high school dropouts, to drug use, to homicides, to imprisonment. And we've done some research on that ourselves. And we also found that in more income unequal countries, there are more social ills. However, it's not the most stablest of relationship. The same is true when you look into literature. Some find it, some don't. And the question remains, is there really a mediation? And there's not much, or there literally isn't any research that actually looks at this mediation. One of the few papers that looks at the mediation doesn't find it. So we cannot link income inequality to conflict perception, to subjective well-being. So here too, we need more research that looks into such mediation and in the relationship between income inequality, conflicts, or social problems and subjective well-being. A second very prominent link between income inequality and subjective well-being is social capital. This thesis came from the public health research, with the name of the income inequality hypothesis. And the general idea was that in more income unequal countries, the level of trust erodes, social capital erodes, and that leads to negative health outcomes. And this hypothesis has since made its way into subjective well-being research. And again, there is a lot of research that shows that social capital erodes when income inequality is high. We can look at political participation, at civic participation, social participation, at levels of trust, of course. However, again, with not so straightforward results. In some countries, there is also a positive link here. And this is actually one of the pathways where we have a little research on the mediation path from inequality to general trust to happiness. And both results I brought here for the US and for Europe actually do find this mediating effect. So this is one of the mechanisms where we have some research, but still there's not too much research out there on this mediation effect as well. So we still need or have a lot to do, or a lot of options to do something on this mediation, on how inequality actually affects subjective well-being. Moving on to the social psychological pathways, I think one of the most prominent examples here is the tunnel effect that was proposed by Hirschman and Rothschild, who argued that in the early stages of economic development in a society, there's a positive link between income inequality and well-being, because people have positive expectations about their own social mobility in the future. So they see other people moving upwards and they expect to be moving upwards very soon too. However, then in the long run, when inequalities consolidate, then people are confronted with unmet expectations because they didn't move up. This can fuel anger, disappointment, and lead to social conflict, thus producing a negative link between inequality and subjective well-being. Again, there's some indication that this is true. The research finds a flattening relationship between Gini and subjective well-being in more developed countries. So in developing countries, we see this positive, and then in advanced societies, there's no relationship anymore. Others find this U-shape where there's a turning point where income inequality becomes just too high, and then the curve drops down. And there's also some indication that this has something to do with the reference income. So people actually comparing themselves with others There's a very nice paper that illustrates this by Claudia Senig from 2008, where she shows that in the early years after 1990 in Eastern Europe, there's a strong positive link in most countries between inequality and subjective well-being, whereas in Western Europe, there is a negative relationship. Especially interesting is the case of Poland, because they had a negative relationship before 1990, which then turned positively only after 1990. So there's some indication that this might be true, but here we are lacking any mediation results that would show this complete picture from income inequality, social mobility to subjective well-being.
Leonie, 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. I will run. Okay, there's a lot to criticize about the tunnel effect. First of all, that upward mobility doesn't necessarily lead to more inequality, but if poor people move up, this would lead to less inequality. But more importantly, for my point, is that it is very one-sided to expect people to have positive expectations when income inequality rises. It's very likely that people, especially on the top, will fear social mobility, and others, especially at the bottom, will feel left behind. And this is the final pathway that I want to present at this point, which links income inequality to social comparisons, to negative subjective well-being. And the idea here is that when income inequality is high, we have a more competitive style of interaction in society, which then leads to more comparisons with real or abstract others, and to more negative interactions. And all of this produces negative status experiences, such as status anxieties, feeling of inferiority. And here again, we have some evidence that shows that in more income unequal countries, there are higher levels of status anxiety, and that higher levels of status anxiety are consistently negatively linked with well-being. However, and I feel very ashamed of saying this because I've worked on this topic for 3 years and never had the idea to test this mediation. There's only one paper that actually tests the mediation, showing that higher levels of income inequality lead to higher levels of status anxiety, which then in turn lead to lower levels of subjective well-being. I think, yeah. So we have a lot of ideas on mechanisms between income inequality, how income inequality relates to subjective well-being. And we have bits and pieces of evidence that some of these pathways might hold truer than others. But as of now, we don't really know how this relates to other kinds of inequalities. And this is probably more theoretical than an actual methodological or research empirical problem, because as I've shown in the beginning, there is a huge difference between income inequality and other types of inequalities, such as the ecological Gini or gender inequality. So we might even need different pathways to explain the link between these inequalities and subjective well-being. And in a final point, really quickly, I want to make up one new point. We've so far only talked about levels of subjective well-being, which is good. It's good to strive for improving people's lives and to have more happy people or a higher level of subjective well-being in society. But our goals should not only be to have a higher overall level, but also to have a lesser inequality in subjective well-being. As I said in the beginning, this is a growing field. More and more people are researching well-being inequality, and I hope to be one of these people very soon. What Ruud Veenhoven provides us on his database shows us that we have good reason to look into well-being inequality because it is negatively related to overall levels of well-being. So if we want to improve overall levels of well-being, then it is obviously a good idea to reduce well-being inequality. What I didn't know is that the Gallup World Poll now has their own measure of well-being inequality. They use a share ratio where they can show that the inequality in well-being has been rising in the past years worldwide. Another measure to measure well-being inequality, which is used by Ruud Veenhoven, is the standard deviation from the mean, where we can see that in the times of economic growth, well-being inequality was decreasing. So we might look at an issue of measurement when we contrast this positive effect from 2008 to 2018, or this positive trajectory, with this negative trajectory until 2007, but it might just be that there has been a U-turn in inequality for well-being, as we have seen a U-turn in income inequality years before. And finally, there's good reason to relate inequality and well-being to or there's some evidence that there's good reason to relate inequality in different aspects of life with inequality and well-being. As you can see on the right side, income inequality has been linked positively to inequality and well-being, no matter which measure you are looking at. If you only take standard deviation or a more refined measure. And this is the last two slides that I will give you from my quick scatter plots research, is that we can see that well-being inequality is also more pronounced in countries with higher gender inequality and in countries with higher political inequality. So not just for improving overall levels of subjective well-being, but also for reducing inequality in well-being itself. It makes sense to look at other inequalities than just income inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leonie. Excuse me. Thank you. Very helpful, very broad background. I see some claps from David and Johannes. I will open up questions now. So as mentioned earlier, please write in the chat or raise your virtual hands. And I think we have one. Oh, and then it disappeared. Okay, so I'll start off first. I did have a question. One point you made was the difference between perceptions of inequality and actual inequality. So I wonder if, or how much research there is on perceptions. So if that's the more important driver, should we be working more on perceptions, or should we be working on, the objective distribution? What do you think we should do?
Well, there is some research on perceptions of inequality, and well, if you want to have nice results, then I would suggest, yes, look at perceptions of inequality because they will relate much better to any subjective outcome you put there. But then you come to the problem that how do you change people's perceptions? So, I mean, the idea should be either we then need a link between actual income inequality and how people perceive it. So, I don't know, better information, more education, maybe a system like in Sweden where you can look up other people's incomes to get a better grasp of about what other people earn. But they're both very relevant information and should probably be used simultaneously and not one instead of the other.
Very diplomatic answer. Thanks. Rex, did I see your hand? Did you raise it in the camera? Maybe? No. Okay. All right. So other questions. And I can continue, but it's nice to hear from other people. Please feel free. Here we go. So Katja, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leonie. I wanted to maybe ask you about, we're talking about gender inequality and income inequality, and sort of comparing them in various directions. And I guess I'm following up on the question that was earlier in the chat. So gender inequality is in something, including incomes. So discussing them as mutually exclusive doesn't really make it easier to understand. So could you maybe talk about the overlaps of these inequalities in the outcome that people are interested in versus by some characteristic, whether that's gender or migration status or education, other things that you mentioned. So how should we think about the overlap of those? Is there any difference in how we analyze these two?
Well, first of all, there is not too much overlap. It doesn't necessarily, just because income inequality is high doesn't necessarily mean that gender inequality in income is high. And maybe this was a bad example, because there's of course there's a lot of other inequalities in gender, and especially for Europe, the European Institute for Gender Equality has a broad range of, they have one index of gender equality, and which is composed of a lot of different sub indices. For example, they look at the leisure time men and women have, the amount of care work men do compared to women, the level of, for example, I'm looking for something that is not related to work, a lot of different dimensions of people's lives that structure well-being and are just differently distributed between men and women. It's the difference between the groups that makes for the inequality, and not so much the difference in incomes, because we'll be comparing groups and not levels of different valued goods. Sorry, lost my track of thought here. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Please feel free to just re-ask or ask again.
Yes, no, it does. Yes, and I agree. I was just trying to sort of picture it. It feels like it's a matrix of outcomes in which people can be unequal in, and characteristics that could be associated. So income inequality can be between different people with different characteristics, but people with these different characteristics can be unequal in various sorts of outcomes. As though gender pay gap or access to leisure or the second shift or any others. So I guess I was wondering whether we should look at these two ways of analyzing inequality with relation to well-being in any different way, given you brought them up as slightly different, or no. I'm not sure if I'm making sense of this. Do you?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure where you're headed, but I'll just try and throw some answers at you, and you pick whatever you like. So I think we should look at these inequalities very, very differently. That's kind of a point I tried to make in the beginning, and I think one of the most important aspects that we should look at is the level of inequality. Because with inequality, we always have a kind of normative aspect. Because as I said in the beginning, just because something is unequally distributed, it needn't be a problem that we need to address. Only if it becomes a problem to people or to society then it is something that we as well-being researchers should look at. But this also means that there is there's a normative component in there, because we have to find the point that people and society find a good inequality, because only then we know what we should aspire to increase people's well-being or lower well-being inequality. And this is the tricky part, because we have to find this point in the data. And for income inequality, there is no such thing as like a perfect point, whereas for inequality between groups, it needn't be men and women, it can be people with and without a migration background. For example, inequality in education between children with a migration background and children without. I think we can all agree that here equality would be the ideal. So this would be one of the major differences, I would argue, there is between these types of inequality, comparing vertical and horizontal parameters, that for the one we can normatively argue for equality, whereas for the other it becomes complicated. And the same principle became clear for me with the ecological inequality. When we look at the difference at this exposure to ecological risks between men and women, they have another indicator that looks at white people compared to non-white people. Then it becomes, to me, it is evident that as a society, we would find it normatively good to not have a difference here. So we could all say, okay, equality is the goal here. Whereas for the Gini of exposure, I have thought about this for days now. I don't know what would be an ideal level of Gini of exposure to ecological risk. So the question that follows from that is that maybe not everything that we can measure can be put into terms of inequality. Maybe there is no ideal Gini of ecological exposure because it simply doesn't make sense. We don't want any exposure to ecological risk and not a more or less equal distribution of it. But it does make sense when we compare groups. So this would be an inequality that only makes sense when we look at the exposure of different groups, but not when we look at the overall distribution of ecological risks across the society, for example.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leonie. Katja, did you have a follow? I think you said something, but you were muted.
No, I just said thank you very much. That yeah, that does answer my question. And there's a quick economist thought on exposure to ecological factors. So as an economist, I would put it in the framework of externalities. So people who get exposed should be compensated for that. But that is a very different debate. That doesn't have to do with that other mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But Leonie, I think it's easy to say that some inequalities are worse than others. And then, yeah, how you do that with the vertical or the horizontal.
Make an example. What inequality is worse than another?
Some of that is the examples, the ascribed factors. So things that you have no influence over, whereas things that you acquire may be based on behavioral choice that we are not observing. And maybe that is actually something that people have worked towards. Let's say one person prefers more leisure time and another person prefers more income. And so the ascribed are things that people don't choose. And that could be a worse inequality than something that is acquired, especially when we're not observing all the behavior. And that was, just off the top of my head, it'd be fun to discuss further. So yeah, in general, I'm agreeing with your previous statements. We do have another question from Cesare, who asks about the inequality of opportunities. And he's thinking that this may be worse than, and it's related to what I also just described. So if you're born into low opportunities, that could be worse than alternatives. And he'd like to know if about the research that has been done on this topic. And if I may, I would add in social mobility. So social mobility and opportunities.
Okay, a lot of different points. Let's start with the opportunities and the preferences, because they sort of go hand in hand. So this is a big problem, especially when we look at ascribed inequalities. There is an example that I didn't bring with me because I find it can not disturb people, but well, some people might understand it incorrectly and then think that I have no idea what I'm talking about. In this text from Steinringen, he says that of course we should look at opportunities. I'm looking for it, but okay. Especially for gender inequality. So if we find that there are more men CEOs than women CEOs, it might be that there is a difference in opportunities for women than for men to become CEOs, but it might just be, and he puts this very nicely, that women are smarter than men and are not willing to waste all their leisure time away for a little bit more money, a little bit more prestige. So the result that we see and that we count might not be a result of differing opportunities, but instead of different preferences. Sorry. The problem is that we cannot really measure opportunities. We can, of course, we can measure legal opportunities. That's a good thing. Like, for example, laws that restrict different payments between different people for the same work. But this is hard to put into numbers, and opportunities are generally hard to measure. As someone who's worked with the capability approach and has not been able to really measure capabilities, I know what I'm talking about. That it's always easier to measure the outcome than the opportunities that people have. But then we encounter the problem of preference. We don't know if the result that we see is actually the result of inequality in a society, or whether it's a consequence of preferences. And then there is another point related to that, and that is the shift of inequality that might occur. For example, if we see that women participate more in the labor market, which is very often used as a measure of gender equality, then we might see actually an increase in gender inequality, because now women not only have to do the work at home, the care work and the housework, but they do too have to work in the labor market. So they now have this double burden. So we actually see an increase of inequality in the actual work, paid and unpaid, that women do, which we measure as higher equality. So there's a lot of issues with the measurement of these inequalities in ascribed factors. And another point that is important with the ascribed factors is that this is it's a very old term, and it's a very sociological term. I don't know if any other scientists actually use this differentiation between achieved and ascribed, it always makes me think about times when we still had a clergy and you were born and you were ascribed the class you were in. But when we talk about horizontal parameters and say, oh yeah, they're ascribed, then there are some aspects, like for example, migration status. That is a horizontal parameter, but it is actually, in the sense of the word, something that people achieved. I mean, they took their stuff, they moved to another country. It's not something that just happened and then someone points at them and says, oh, you have a migration status. Of course, it is ascribed in the sense that it needn't be an important category. It is because we as a society make it an important category. And because this is something that we find important. The same with gender. There's no reason we find gender important. It is something that we have to decide to differentiate people on. We could have decided on something else. We could have said, oh, large people and smaller people, or people with red hair. There are a lot of different ways to differentiate between people, but we've decided on a few of these ascribed characteristics. But the point is that with the migration status, you have something that people actually did do, and they did do it for a reason, and the reasons can vary. And thus, additionally to all the problems that migration brings with itself, because then people have the experience of another system and they bring it into, maybe you come from a very unequal country, you bring that perception of inequality into a more equal country. Additionally to that, you now have your own category of inequality that you yourself made happen, because now you're maybe discriminated, maybe there is more or less inequality between your category and another, and there might be overlapping ascribed categories. Like, if I don't know, if you're male, or I don't know, maybe female, migrant, and old. Okay, so this is something where I see a lot of problems with the whole horizontal inequalities that need to be figured out. But I have no solutions as of yet. We can talk next year.
Okay, thank you, Leonie. So we are a little bit over time. If anybody has a last burning question, now is the time for it. And it looks like I don't see anyone. So Leonie, if you have any last words for us, otherwise I can say thank you and very much for this nice overview of inequality. I didn't know there was so much to know about inequality. Any last questions, points for us? Looks like that's it. So, oh, here we are. Just a thank you. Nice overview from Darren.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So many people interested in inequality, and I hope, of course, I've inspired some ideas for research, and we'll read about it or hear about it very soon.
Great, thank you very much. We'll close here. Have a great night.